If you're Generation X, there is something you probably do automatically. When you feel overwhelmed, you don't panic. You don't complain. You don't ask for help. You feel guilty. Guilty for slowing down. Guilty for needing reassurance. Guilty for having emotions that don't seem practical or necessary. And most of the time, you don't question that guilt. You assume it says something about you. But what if it doesn't? What if that guilt isn't a personality trait at all? What if it's something that was carefully, quietly taught? Generation X was not raised to be emotionally expressive. They were raised to be emotionally manageable, not dramatic, not needy, not disruptive. And over time, that expectation became internal. So internal that it no longer feels imposed. It feels natural. Generation X grew up during a period of transition, socially, economically, emotionally. Many parents were overwhelmed themselves. Families were adjusting to changing roles, changing values, changing pressures. So children learned early that stability mattered more than expression, that coping mattered more than processing, that staying functional mattered more than being understood. The message was rarely spoken out loud. It didn't need to be. It was communicated through absence, through silence, through what wasn't asked on and what wasn't followed up on. If you handled things on your own, everything ran smoother. If you didn't, things became complicated. So you learned. You learned to minimize your needs. You learned to keep emotions contained. You learned to sense when something would be inconvenient to bring up. And slowly, almost invisibly, guilt became part of the system. Not guilt for doing something wrong, but guilt for needing anything at all. Many Generation X children became self-sufficient very early. They learned how to get themselves home, how to fill time alone, how to regulate themselves without guidance. Independence was praised. Emotional dependence was quietly discouraged. Not through punishment, but through lack of response. When emotions were ignored, minimized, or met with discomfort, the lesson was clear. Your inner world is something you should handle privately. So you did. You adapted by becoming low maintenance, by staying out of the way, by learning how to function without drawing attention. And that adaptation worked. You survived. You coped. You became capable. But adaptation always comes with a cost. The cost was not the loss of emotion. It was the association between emotion and burden. Over time, feelings didn't disappear. They just became something to manage carefully, something to edit, something to apologize for. This is where guilt first took root, not as shame, not as fear, but as a quiet internal signal that said, this might be too much, this might cause trouble, this might inconvenience someone. That signal became automatic, so automatic that you stopped noticing it. As you grew older, the expectations didn't disappear. They became more refined. Be responsible, be composed, be reliable, handle things. So when life became stressful, you didn't ask what you needed, you asked what you could handle. When you felt emotional, you didn't explore the feeling, you controlled it. Not because you didn't care, but because caring felt risky. Risky in a subtle way. Not dangerous, just unwelcome. Over time, this conditioning solidified into an inner voice. A voice that monitors your emotions before anyone else can react to them. A voice that says, you should be able to deal with this. You're making it bigger than it needs to be. Other people have real problems. Don't be dramatic. Don't be selfish. This didn't appear in adulthood. It was installed much earlier. And once it's internalized, it doesn't require external pressure anymore. Even when no one is watching, it keeps working. This is why guilt is such a common emotional baseline for Generation X. Not intense guilt, not overwhelming guilt. A low-level, constant sense that your emotions need justification. That rest must be earned. That support must be deserved. That vulnerability needs a reason. This is also why many Gen X adults struggle to name what they feel. Not because they lack emotional intelligence, but because their emotions learned to stay below the surface. Emotions were compressed, simplified, filtered. Strong reactions were softened. Subtle needs were ignored. So instead of clear emotional signals, there is often a vague sense of discomfort, a tension without a name, an exhaustion without a clear cause. And guilt fills in the gap. It explains the discomfort without requiring exploration. It gives the feeling a label that ends the conversation. I'm just being weak. I shouldn't feel this way. I need to get over it. So the emotion gets shut down before it can fully form. This process didn't make Generation X emotionally cold. It made them emotionally contained, highly functional, highly controlled, and quietly overwhelmed. The irony is that this often gets misinterpreted as strength. From the outside, Generation X appears resilient, independent, unbothered. But internally, there is often a constant negotiation happening. Is this worth mentioning? Is this too much? Should I just deal with it? That negotiation is exhausting. And because it's been happening for decades, it feels normal. Many Gen X adults don't describe themselves as anxious or depressed. They describe themselves as tired. Tired in a way that rest doesn't fully fix. Tired in a way that feels emotional, not physical. That fatigue isn't laziness. It's the cost of long-term emotional self-regulation, of always keeping feelings in check, of always managing yourself. This is the hidden part of guilt. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And because it whispers, it often goes unquestioned. But it's always there. In the pause before you speak. In the hesitation before you ask for help. In the apology before you express how you feel. And the longer it stays unexamined, it feels like identity. Like this is just how you are. But it isn't. It's how you learned to be. Generation X didn't grow up emotionally unsupported because anyone intended harm. They grew up in systems that prioritized stability over expression. So they adapted in the smartest way possible. They became manageable. They became strong in a very specific way. A way that required silence, restraint, control. And that strength worked. Until it didn't. Because emotional control without emotional release eventually turns inward. It becomes guilt. It becomes numbness. It becomes distance from yourself. And that is where many Generation X adults find themselves today. Not broken, not weak, but carrying an emotional pattern that no longer serves them. In the next part, we'll look at how this guilt shows up in adult life, in relationships, in work, in exhaustion that doesn't seem to make sense, and why understanding this pattern changes everything.
That guilt doesn't stay in childhood. It follows Generation X into adulthood quietly, patiently, shaping behavior without ever announcing itself. It shows up not as crisis, but as pattern. In adult relationships, guilt often appears as hesitation. You feel something strongly, but before you express it, you pause. You measure it. You soften it. You translate it into something more acceptable. You say you're fine when you're not. You say it's not a big deal when it is. You apologize for emotions that don't need apologies. Not because you don't trust the other person, but because needing emotional space feels uncomfortable. For many in Generation X, closeness was never modeled as something safe and mutual. It was something you navigated carefully. So vulnerability feels exposed, messy, risky, even with people you love. This creates a strange dynamic. You can be deeply loyal, deeply committed, deeply caring, and still feel emotionally distant. Not because you don't feel enough, but because you learned to filter what you feel before it reaches the surface. At work, guilt takes a different form. It shows up as overfunctioning. You take on more than you should. You push through exhaustion. You hesitate to rest. Not because you love work, but because rest feels undeserved. There's often an internal rule that says rest must be justified, earned, explained. So you keep going, even when your body is asking you to slow down, even when your focus is gone, even when the work itself has lost meaning. This isn't ambition, it's conditioning. It's the same emotional system that learned early on not to be a burden. In personal life, guilt often turns into isolation. Not dramatic isolation, not cutting people off, but a quiet habit of handling things alone. You don't reach out right away. You wait until things are bad enough. And sometimes, by the time they are, you're already exhausted. So you withdraw. And from the outside, this can look like emotional distance, but internally, it feels like self-containment, like you're doing what you've always done, holding yourself together. What's rarely acknowledged is how much energy this takes. Constant emotional monitoring is draining, deciding what to say, what to share, what to suppress. Over time, this creates a specific kind of fatigue, not the kind sleep fixes, not the kind rest days solve, but a deeper tiredness. A tiredness that comes from never fully relaxing emotionally, from never feeling like it's completely safe to just be. This is why so many Generation X adults describe themselves as tired rather than sad. Sadness implies permission to feel. Tiredness feels more acceptable, more practical, more responsible. So guilt reshapes emotional language itself. It limits what feels allowed. From the outside, this pattern often gets misunderstood. People describe Generation X as emotionally cold, detached, unavailable. But that interpretation misses the point. This isn't emotional absence, it's emotional regulation taken too far. Generation X didn't learn to ignore emotions. They learned to control them continuously. They became highly skilled at staying composed, at staying functional, at staying steady. And that skill was rewarded. It led to reliability, to competence, to independence. But it came with a cost. Because emotions that are always controlled never fully resolve. They accumulate. They turn into tension, into numbness, into a vague sense that something is off. And guilt keeps them contained. It acts like a lid, not allowing emotions to spill over, but also not allowing them to be processed. This is why so many Generation X adults describe themselves as tired rather than sad.
Not in a way that feels alarming, just enough to feel distant, like life is happening, but slightly muted, like emotions exist, but behind glass. This can be especially confusing because on paper, life may look stable. Career, family, responsibilities handled. So when discomfort appears, guilt rushes in to explain it away. There's no reason to feel this way. I should be grateful. I'm just being difficult. And the cycle continues. What's important to understand is that this pattern was never a conscious choice. It wasn't created by a single moment. It was built slowly, through repetition. through environments that valued coping over expressing, functioning over feeling. So when Generation X adults struggle with emotional openness, it isn't because they don't want it. It's because it feels unfamiliar, unsafe in a subtle way. Vulnerability requires a belief that emotions will be received, not managed. And for many, that belief was never formed. Instead, they learned something else. They learned to be the stable one, the reliable one, the person others lean on. And while that role can feel meaningful, it often leaves little room for personal emotional support. So you become strong for everyone else, and quietly strong for yourself. But strength without release becomes strain. This is where validation matters, not reassurance, not advice, understanding. Generation X didn't fail to develop emotionally. They adapted to what was available. They became emotionally efficient. They learned how to survive without drawing attention to their needs. That adaptation deserves respect. It worked when it had to. But what worked then may no longer serve now. The guilt that once kept things running smoothly may now be the thing that keeps emotions stuck. Understanding this doesn't erase the pattern overnight, but it changes the relationship to it. Instead of seeing guilt as proof of weakness, it can be seen as a signal, a learned response, a reminder of how early emotional responsibility began. And when guilt is understood as conditioning rather than identity, it loses some of its authority. It becomes something you notice rather than something you obey. This doesn't mean emotions suddenly become easy, but they become possible. There is more space to pause before suppressing, more room to question the internal voice that says, "Handle it." More permission to feel without immediately justifying it. For many in Generation X, this understanding alone is significant, not because it fixes everything, but because it explains so much. Why rest feels uncomfortable, why emotions feel heavy, why connection feels complicated. And explanation creates relief. Not dramatic relief, but a quiet easing, a sense that maybe you were never broken. Maybe you were just carrying a system that was never meant to last forever. Guilt may still appear, but it no longer has to define you. It can be recognized as something you learned, not something you are. And that recognition is often the first moment when emotional life begins to feel less like a burden and more like something that belongs to you.